Welcome to a journey back to one of the darkest and most thrilling eras of the Roman Empire. A time of betrayal, bloodshed, and battles that almost shattered the world's mightiest empire. Picture this: a whirlwind of emperors rising and falling, armies marching across desolate fields, and barbarian forces closing in from every side. In this episode, we're diving deep into the true Game of Thrones, where every ruler's claim to power teetered on a knife's edge, and one wrong move meant deadly consequences. Ever wondered how the empire survived when its own legions rebelled, generals turned into emperors, and Rome itself trembled under foreign invasion? This is the saga of Emperors Decius, Gallus, Valerian, and Gallienus, a brutal chapter in history where every day felt like the empire's last. Strap in, because what you're about to hear is more intense than any fiction. Let's dive into the chaos.
All right, so you want to plunge headfirst into the Roman Empire, specifically the mid-240s to 260s AD.
Right.
It's what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century.
A fascinating and tumultuous period.
And you want to see how an empire as mighty as Rome could crumble?
Yes, exactly.
Well, for this deep dive, we're turning to Edward Gibbon's classic, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Chapter 10.
It's not just, a few barbarian skirmishes.
Oh, no.
It was a perfect storm.
Invasions, internal power struggles, plagues, even economic turmoil, all converging at once. It's really quite remarkable.
Now, the Roman Empire at this point, controlling territory from modern-day Britain all the way to North Africa and the Middle East.
A vast, vast empire.
So many borders to defend.
And those borders were starting to feel the pressure. They certainly were.
Gibbon really emphasizes how this period challenged the very foundations of Roman power.
He does.
He calls these 20 years of shame and misfortune.
An empire teetering on the brink of collapse.
And you can really feel that sense of, impending doom as you read through his account.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just external threats.
No, the Roman Empire was also crumbling from within. It was.
Now imagine this. The emperor, the symbol of unity and strength,
Right.
being assassinated with alarming regularity.
Not just a few isolated incidents.
A rapid succession of emperors.
Murdered, often by their own soldiers.
Makes you wonder, who could you trust?
Exactly. If the emperor isn't safe, who is?
And that constant threat of assassination,
Created a climate of fear and uncertainty.
which paralyzed decision-making, undermined the authority of the empire.
A pattern we see repeated throughout history. Internal divisions make a society far more vulnerable
Right.
to external threats.
And that brings us to Emperor Decius.
Mm.
His story perfectly illustrates how quickly fortunes could change during this chaotic period.
A respected senator.
Initially resisted taking on the role of emperor.
Even warned others about the dangers of military leadership.
Mm-hmm.
But fate, as it often does, had other plans.
Yeah.
A rebellion broke out
Right.
in the Roman legions stationed in Moesia.
Modern-day Bulgaria and Serbia.
They demanded that Decius take the throne.
So he was basically forced into the job.
In a way, yes.
The soldiers gave him an ultimatum: accept the purple or face execution.
Decius, caught between a rock and a hard place.
Chose what he likely saw as the lesser of two evils.
Right.
And just like that,
He went from reluctant senator to Emperor of Rome.
Emperor of Rome. But this sudden rise to power meant confronting Philip.
The emperor he'd inadvertently overthrown.
They met in battle near Verona.
Decius emerged victorious.
Philip was killed, cementing Decius's position as the new emperor.
Tough.
There's always a but.
His reign was short-lived,
Incredibly turbulent.
largely due to the emergence of a new and formidable threat,
The Goths.
the Goths. This marked their first major appearance on the Roman historical stage,
And they came in swinging.
with a ferocity that caught the Romans completely off guard.
Now, you mentioned in our prep notes that these Goths were different from the ones we see later in Roman history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
These weren't the Goths of the later so-called Dark Ages.
Right. Much more integrated.
Much more integrated into Roman society and culture.
Right.
These Goths,
Fresh out of the northern forest.
driven by a hunger for land and plunder.
Under their leader,
Eniva,
Cneva, they swept through the Roman province of Dacia,
modern-day Romania.
leaving a trail of destruction in their wake.
Dacia.
Now, Dacia was a relatively new addition to the Roman Empire,
It was.
conquered by Emperor Trajan.
Just over a century earlier.
Its resources, especially its gold mines, were highly valued by the Romans.
Highly valued.
So the Gothic invasion was a blow.
A serious blow.
They weren't just raiding for quick spoil.
They were aiming to conquer and settle.
Posing a serious threat to Roman control of the region.
A serious threat indeed.
And this is where we see Decius's military experience come into play.
He recognized the danger posed by the Goths.
Immediately marched his army north to confront them.
Here we go again. That confrontation didn't exactly go as planned.
No, it did not. The Romans, confident in their superior discipline and equipment, underestimated the Goths.
They did.
At the Battle of Forum Terebronii.
Decius's forces were lured into a marshy area,
where their heavy armor became a liability.
The Goths, lighter and more agile, surrounded the Romans.
Inflicted a crushing defeat.
A crushing defeat.
And Decius himself was killed in the battle.
The first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy.
Imagine the shock that must have reverberated through the empire.
The emperor fleeing before half-armed barbarians?
Like Gibbon puts it, and then dying in a bog.
Powerful symbol of how vulnerable Rome had become.
This wasn't just a military loss.
No.
It was a symbolic blow to the heart of the Roman Empire, a chink in the armor of their perceived invincibility.
It makes you wonder, how did the average Roman citizen react to this news?
It's hard to say for sure. Did they see it as a sign that the empire was crumbling?
I imagine news of the emperor's death would have spread quickly.
Right through the empire.
Carried by merchants, travelers, and soldiers.
And with the Goths still on the rampage, fear and uncertainty would have gripped many Roman communities.
Absolutely.
So the defeat at Forum Terebronii was bad enough.
It was.
But the Goths weren't done yet.
They weren't.
In fact, they were just getting started.
Right.
What we see next is a dramatic shift in their strategy.
A shift that will take the Romans by surprise.
And further expose the empire's weaknesses.
The Goths, emboldened by their victory, turn their attention to the sea.
To the sea.
They launch an unprecedented naval campaign.
An unprecedented naval campaign.
One that will terrorize the coasts of the Black Sea and even reach into the Aegean.
Wait, hold on. The Goths had a navy?
They did.
I always pictured them as fierce land warriors, charging into battle on horseback or on foot.
I understand.
Weren't they from the landlocked forests of northern Europe?
They were?
Where did they even get ships?
It's what makes this period so fascinating.
Okay.
It challenges our preconceived notions about these barbarians.
Right.
Remember, the Goths were a pragmatic people.
They were?
They were quick to adapt and learn.
Uh-huh.
They weren't afraid to adopt new strategies and technologies to achieve their goals.
They had ships.
They did. As the geographer Strabo tells us, they used small, light ships.
That could hold only 25, 30 men each.
25, 30 men each.
So not exactly the mighty Roman galleys we often picture when we think of ancient naval warfare.
No, these ships weren't built for open ocean voyages or epic sea battles.
Okay, so these small ships.
Perfect for raiding and quick strikes along coastlines.
Along coastlines.
By lashing together hundreds of these vessels.
Hundreds?
The Goths were able to assemble a surprisingly formidable fleet.
Okay, so they've got this, I guess, ragtag fleet.
Yes.
But they don't exactly set sail for Rome.
No, they didn't have the naval power to challenge Rome directly.
So what's their strategy here?
They had a keen understanding of the empire's vulnerabilities.
Wow.
The Romans controlled the Mediterranean, but they had always considered the Black Sea to be a relatively safe backwater.
A safe backwater.
Suddenly, Roman coastal cities and trading posts, completely unprepared for a naval assault, were wide open to attack.
So it's like a sneak attack.
Precisely.
Exploiting a blind spot in Roman defenses.
A classic tactic, even in modern warfare.
So where does this Gothic armada strike first?
Their ships set sail from the Crimean Peninsula, which they had recently conquered, and began raiding cities along the southern coast of the Black Sea.
Okay.
Cities like Trebizond,
a major trading center,
with connections all over the Roman world,
were sacked and plundered.
They were.
And then they sailed right through the Bosphorus.
The narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia.
And entered the Aegean Sea.
The Aegean Sea.
That must have been terrifying for the people living in those coastal cities.
Pure chaos and terror.
To suddenly see these barbarian ships appearing on the horizon.
Knowing that their homes and livelihoods were about to be attacked.
And this is when they attack Athens.
They did.
Athens, though no longer the political powerhouse it had been centuries earlier, was still a major cultural center.
It was.
The Goths sacked the city.
Burning temples and looting treasures.
There's even a story that they almost destroyed Athens' libraries.
A possibly apocryphal story?
Which would have been an immeasurable loss for Western civilization.
It would have been.
It makes you wonder how much of our knowledge of ancient Greece we would have lost.
A sobering thought.
It is.
It highlights the destructive potential of these conflicts.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about territory or resources.
It was about the destruction of knowledge, culture, and the very fabric of civilization. It's amazing how the Goths managed to navigate these unfamiliar waters.
They did.
And find the best targets for their raids.
They were far from random.
Were they just sailing around randomly?
No.
Or did they have a plan?
The Goths, despite their reputation as barbarians, were surprisingly adept at gathering intelligence and utilizing local knowledge.
They relied heavily on local guides.
People who knew the coastlines, the harbors, and could lead them to the richest and most vulnerable targets.
So people living within the Roman Empire were actually helping the Goths to attack it.
It's a sad but recurring theme throughout history.
When an empire begins to decline,
its internal divisions often create opportunities for its enemies.
So the Goths were able to exploit these divisions.
Recruiting escaped slaves, disgruntled locals, and even deserters from the Roman army.
To bolster their forces.
It's
a reminder that these so-called barbarian invasions were often aided and abetted by people living within the empire itself.
They were.
People who, for various reasons, felt more loyalty to the invaders than to the Roman state.
Yes.
It makes you wonder if those people saw the Goths as liberators.
Or just a different kind of oppressor.
Right.
It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
And it speaks to the complex social and political dynamics at play during this period.
Right.
The Roman Empire wasn't a monolith. It was a patchwork of different cultures, ethnicities, and loyalties. Mm-hmm. And as the crisis deepened, those internal tensions began to surface.
So while the Goths are raiding all over the Black Sea and the Aegean,
right.
What's Rome doing about this?
Well, they did try to stop them.
I would imagine so.
But their efforts were hampered. A combination of factors, internal instability, stretched resources. And perhaps most importantly, the emergence of a new and formidable enemy on their eastern frontier, the Sasanian Persian Empire. This meant that Rome was now facing a two-front war. A situation that would test its resilience to the breaking point.
Right. Now, the Sasanians were a force to be reckoned with.
They were.
Their king, Sapor.
Sounds
like the Persian version of Genghis Khan.
Sapor was a formidable ruler. That's for sure.
His father,
Artaxerxes,
had already overthrown the Parthian Empire.
And established the Sasanian dynasty as the new power in Persia. And Sapor was determined to expand his empire's territory and influence.
Even if it meant clashing with the weakened but still mighty Roman Empire.
He was.
And their first target was Armenia. A region that had long been a buffer state between Rome and Persia.
Exactly.
Strategically vital.
It was.
Controlled key trade routes. Served as a buffer between the two empires.
So when Sapor conquered Armenia, it wasn't just a territorial gain.
A major blow to Roman prestige.
And influence in the East.
It
also signaled Sapor's ambitions.
Oh.
He wasn't content with simply defending his borders.
He was aiming to expand his empire at Rome's expense.
He was.
Which brings us to Emperor Valerian.
Decius' successor.
He realizes that this Persian threat is too serious to ignore.
He does.
Assembles an army and marches east to confront Sapor.
A clash of titans.
It sounds like.
The Roman emperor versus the Persian king.
And for Valerian,
it would become a personal tragedy.
A
story of misplaced trust.
Battlefield blunders.
And ultimately, one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history.
Okay, that sounds like a story we need to unpack carefully.
We do.
What exactly happened to Valerian?
It all starts with Valerian placing too much trust in his Praetorian prefect.
Macrianus.
The
emperor's right-hand man.
The head of the Praetorian Guard.
The most elite military unit in the Roman army.
He was supposed to be the emperor's most trusted advisor.
The guardian of his safety and a skilled military commander.
The second most powerful man in the empire.
So Macrianus must have been incredibly competent and loyal.
He should have been.
To have earned that position.
Yes.
What went wrong?
It's unclear whether it was outright treachery or just sheer incompetence. But what we do know is that following Macrianus' advice, Valerian led the Roman army into a disastrous situation
against
Sapor's forces, the city of Edessa.
In what is now southeastern Turkey.
Southeastern Turkey.
So he basically walked right into a trap.
That's one way to put it.
The details are debated by historians.
They are.
But the outcome is clear.
The Romans were surrounded
By the Persian army.
their supply lines cut off, and their situation growing increasingly desperate.
So what was Sapor's strategy?
He was a master of psychological warfare.
Well,
He knew that famine and disease would weaken the Roman army.
far more effectively than a direct assault.
He simply waited,
Waited.
allowing the trapped Romans to slowly wither under the scorching Mesopotamian sun.
That's brutal but effective.
It was.
And I imagine morale in the Roman camp must have been plummeting with each passing day.
You can imagine the scene. Thousands of Roman soldiers trapped in a hostile land.
Their supplies dwindling.
Sickness spreading.
The constant fear of a Persian attack looming over them.
All the while, their emperor, the man who was supposed to lead them to victory,
Had no plan to escape this predicament.
it seemed that way.
So what does Valerian do?
His options were limited.
Facing mutiny and with no hope of a military victory, Valerian was forced to negotiate. He offered a vast sum of gold in exchange for safe passage.
For himself and his army back to Roman territory.
Sounds like a desperate gamble.
It was.
Did Sapor take the deal?
He did not.
He did not.
Sapor knew he had Valerian right where he wanted him.
Oh boy.
He rejected the offer and instead demanded that Valerian meet him in person.
To discuss terms of surrender.
To discuss terms of surrender.
That never ends well.
It doesn't.
If an enemy invites you to a parley in the middle of a war, they're probably not planning to serve you tea and biscuits.
A classic power play.
So Valerian, trapped and desperate, had little choice but to comply.
He had to.
He must have known it was a huge risk,
It was.
but he hoped to appeal to Sapor's sense of honor.
To perhaps negotiate a less humiliating surrender.
So what happened at the meeting?
As soon as Valerian arrived at Sapor's camp, he was seized and taken prisoner.
The Roman army, demoralized and leaderless, surrendered to the Persians.
A devastating defeat, a stain on Roman honor that would resonate for centuries.
And for Valerian,
It marked the beginning of a long and agonizing captivity.
one that would end in his death.
And cement his place as one of the most unfortunate emperors in Roman history.
One of the most unfortunate emperors in Roman history.
Indeed.
It's hard to even imagine the humiliation for the Romans, their emperor, paraded as a trophy by his Persian captor.
The Roman sources painted a pretty gruesome picture.
Understandably.
Some claim Valerian was subjected to all sorts of horrific tortures and humiliations.
I bet they didn't hold back on the propaganda.
Exactly.
They'd portray Sapor as some benevolent ruler,
Right.
offering Valerian afternoon tea.
We have to take these Roman accounts with a grain of salt.
Of course.
They were written by people who had every reason to demonize Sapor,
Right.
paint Valerian's capture as a tragedy of epic proportions.
The most famous story, and possibly the most fabricated, is that Sapor used Valerian as a human footstool whenever he mounted his horse.
It's a powerful image.
Even if it's not true.
It shows how deeply this defeat impacted the Roman psyche.
Their emperor, reduced to a captive, a prop in a foreign king's propaganda.
Precisely, it reinforced that sense of vulnerability.
That the empire was no longer invincible.
And remember, this is all happening while the Goths are running rampant in the north and the east.
A multi-pronged assault on the very fabric of Roman power.
That's right.
And it wasn't just about military defeats.
No, it wasn't.
It's like the whole empire was starting to unravel from the inside out.
Absolutely.
We've talked about the political instability, the assassinations,
Right.
the constant threat of usurpers.
But there's another layer to this crisis that often gets overlooked.
What's that?
The economic turmoil.
Yeah, because war is expensive, no matter who's winning.
It is.
And Rome was fighting on multiple fronts.
They were trying to hold back the Goths, the Persians, and putting down internal rebellions all at the same time.
All at the same time.
These weren't short, contained conflicts that
Right.
were happening simultaneously across vast distances.
Funding legions, building fortifications, even bribing barbarians to stay away. That takes serious cash.
It does.
Gibbon doesn't go into great detail on economics,
No, he doesn't.
but you can sense the strain reading between the lines.
You can.
So if the empire is falling apart, people are fleeing, trade is disrupted, where does that cash even come from?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
And where we can start to see parallels with economic crises throughout history.
Emperors.
Like Gallienus resorted to debasing the currency.
They started putting less and less silver in the coins,
A classic short-term solution.
with long-term consequences.
It certainly had consequences.
I'm guessing this didn't really help with the whole loyalty to the emperor thing?
Not at all. Imagine you're a merchant.
Okay.
You've worked hard your whole life, saved up a decent amount of silver, and suddenly it's worth half of what it was a year ago.
You'd be upset.
You will.
And you might be more willing to listen to someone who promises a better deal.
Even if that someone is a barbarian or a rebel leader.
Debasing the currency led to rampant inflation,
Eroding trust in the government.
and further destabilizing the empire.
A pattern we see repeated throughout history. Economic hardship breeds social unrest.
And creates fertile ground for revolution.
It does.
Now, it couldn't have been easy being a Roman citizen during the crisis of the 3rd century.
It was a terrifying and uncertain time for many Romans.
And the upheavals went far beyond just military conflicts.
They did.
The entire fabric of Roman society was fraying at the seams.
It was.
So it wasn't just the barbarians and the power-hungry generals causing problems.
No, the crisis touched every aspect of Roman life.
In Sicily, there were slave revolts.
Targeting the wealthy Roman estates that dominated the island's economy.
And Alexandria, one of the empire's most important cities,
A center of trade and culture.
was ravaged by a brutal civil war.
A city turning on itself.
Neighbor against neighbor.
Imagine that.
It's a stark reminder that when central authority collapses,
When people lose faith in their institutions.
even the most civilized societies can descend into chaos.
They can.
Makes you think about the importance of social cohesion.
And the role of government in maintaining order.
And on top of all this, you've got to remember the impact of disease.
Disease.
The constant warfare disrupted agriculture and trade.
Leading to widespread famine.
And with people weakened by hunger,
Plague swept through the empire.
killing millions.
Gibbon cites a chilling figure from Alexandria.
Over half the population perished during this era.
Entire communities wiped out. Cities turned into ghost towns.
Wow.
And this wasn't just happening in Alexandria.
The plague spread throughout the empire, leaving a trail of death and despair in their wake.
They did.
We often think of the Roman Empire as this monolithic, unchanging entity.
Yes.
But moments like this remind us that it was made up of real people
Real people.
who lived through incredibly difficult and challenging times
Times that tested their resilience.
and forced them to confront their own mortality.
And their response to these challenges is what makes this period so fascinating. Okay.
Because even amidst the chaos,
The despair.
the seemingly unstoppable tide of disasters,
There were seeds of change being planted.
there were
Seeds that would eventually blossom into a new kind of Roman Empire. Okay, now you've got me intrigued.
good.
We started this deep dive thinking about doom and gloom,
Right.
the fall of an empire.
But there's a glimmer of hope here.
The Romans managed to pull themselves back from the abyss.
It wasn't a quick or easy process,
Of course not.
but the crisis of the 3rd century forced the Romans to adapt and innovate
It challenged their assumptions about how the empire should be run,
about who should hold power.
even about what it meant to be Roman.
It did.
So, in a way, the crisis was a catalyst for change.
Yes.
It forced them to confront their weaknesses and find new ways to survive.
Exactly. Think about figures like Odenathus and Zenobia.
Odenathus and Zenobia,
They represent the shifting power dynamics within the empire.
the old Roman aristocracy,
The people who had held power for centuries.
they're losing their grip.
New players were emerging, people from the provinces,
People with different backgrounds and experiences.
who were willing to step up and take charge when the traditional elites faltered.
They were.
Almost like the crisis created a vacuum.
And these new leaders, unburdened by tradition, were able to fill it.
They were willing to try new things, to break the mold.
Precisely.
And that willingness to
And
experiment,
to adapt to changing circumstances.
it was crucial to Rome's survival.
It was.
Now, you mentioned one of the key changes was decentralization.
Yes.
Can you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. One of the biggest problems facing the Roman Empire was its rigid, centralized structure,
Everything had to go through Rome.
which made it slow to react to crises on the frontiers,
Imagine trying to govern an empire that stretched from Britain to Syria.
all from a single city.
It was too unwieldy.
Far too unwieldy.
So too much bureaucracy.
Not enough flexibility on the ground.
And the crisis of the 3rd century forced the Romans to rethink this centralized model. Emperors like Gallienus, for all his flaws, realized that they couldn't control everything from Rome.
They realized that.
They had to delegate authority, empower provincial governors to raise their own armies, collect taxes, and deal with local threats.
It was a necessity born out of crisis.
But it also laid the groundwork for a more flexible and resilient empire.
It did.
So sometimes necessity breeds innovation, even if it's messy.
Absolutely. The Romans were pragmatists,
They were willing to learn from their mistakes and adopt whatever worked,
even if it meant abandoning cherished traditions.
or sharing power with people they might have once considered outsiders.
That's right.
And what about the military? Rome's legions were getting hammered by barbarians left and right.
They were.
How did they turn that around?
Well, the Roman military, just like the rest of the empire, had to adapt or die.
Adapt or die.
And they did so in a number of ways. First, they started incorporating more cavalry into their legions.
The traditional Roman army was heavily reliant on infantry,
Those disciplined formations of heavily armed soldiers.
but against fast-moving enemies like the Goths, who were skilled horsemen and archers.
The legions were often too slow and cumbersome,
So they had to become more mobile.
more adaptable to the terrain and the enemy's tactics.
And they did so by adopting some of the tactics and equipment of their enemies.
They did,
They started recruiting more cavalry,
both from within the empire and from allied tribes,
began using lighter armor and weapons.
allowing them to move more quickly and fight more effectively in different environments.
So they were learning from their defeats,
They were.
not just repeating the same mistakes,
They were willing to embrace new ideas.
even those that came from outside the traditional Roman military structure.
Even those.
In a way, the barbarians were helping to save the empire from other barbarians.
It's a bit ironic, isn't it?
It is.
But it also shows that the Romans were never too proud to learn from their enemies.
They understood that survival meant adapting
Evolving.
and incorporating the best ideas, regardless of where they came from.
That's right.
So the Roman army, much like the Roman state itself, was becoming more diverse, more inclusive, and in a way, more representative of the vast empire it was tasked with defending.
Precisely. And this, I think, is one of the most important legacies of the crisis of the 3rd century. It forced the Romans to confront the limitations of their traditional ways of thinking about power, identity, and even what it meant to be Roman.
They had to embrace change, to adapt to new realities.
And to draw strength from the diversity of their vast empire.
And it's fascinating to see how these adaptations, born out of crisis, ultimately laid the foundation for a new era of Roman power, an era that would see the empire not only survive, but thrive for another 2 centuries.
It's a testament to the resilience of human ingenuity, our ability to learn from our mistakes and to adapt to changing circumstances. And it's a reminder that even the mightiest empires are not immune to decline. But with the right combination of leadership, innovation, and a willingness to embrace change, even the most daunting challenges can be overcome.
You've given us a lot to think about with this deep dive. It's been more than just a history lesson. It's been a journey into the heart of a civilization struggling to survive, confronting its own weaknesses, and ultimately finding a way to reinvent itself.
And that's the power of histories, isn't it? It's not just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that have shaped our world and using that knowledge to navigate the challenges we face today.
So as a final thought for our listener, who's probably wrestling with their own set of barbarians at the gates, metaphorically speaking, of course, I want to leave you with this question. Where do you see those echoes of the past in our present? What lessons can we learn from the Roman Empire's struggle to overcome the crisis of the 3rd century? Because as we've learned today, sometimes the fall of an empire can be the birth pangs of something entirely new.